Hello, and welcome to the February 2024 edition of the U3a podcast. I'm Peter Clift, and like you, I'm pleased to see snowdrops and daffodils beginning to appear in our gardens. This month, the podcast team are delighted to welcome another new member to the team, Susie Hodges. Susie has a wealth of professional broadcast experience both here and in Europe, and I'm sure you will join us in giving her a very warm welcome. As always in the U3a podcast, we have plenty to keep you entertained. We hear from a lutenist. That's somebody who plays the lute. No, I didn't know either. Who found himself following in the footsteps of one very famous medieval player.
Galileo the astronomer came from a lute-playing family, and he himself played the lute. So we were actually playing 40 lutes in an orchestra in the church that would have been frequented by Galileo, reproducing a sound that hadn't been heard for 400 years.
And we also have poetry.
Ted Hughes was on the phone to me and he asked me, if I'd been writing anything lately, and I had to confess that I hadn't. And he said, well, that's not good.
We have some cookery advice.
And just slice the potatoes and then gently fry them in a little bit of olive oil, and then just place them on the top, either into the pan, or you can put it into a casserole dish, and then ta-da, it looks like it's been in the oven for hours.
And the news of a new book being published which all the podcast team are eager to hear about. More of that later in the programme. I know it seems a long while ago, but during the COVID pandemic, we were all implored to wash our hands, and then when the vaccines were developed, we were encouraged to get vaccinated. But who actually decided that washing our hands could stop disease spreading? And how do these COVID vaccines work? Dr. Mike Trevethick is a leading member of the u3a Science Network and has worked for many years in medical research. Starting on February the 28th, he will be presenting an online national event for the U3a, consisting of 5 talks focusing on advances in public health, and he said he was inspired to develop this course precisely because of the critical role public health played during the recent pandemic. Susie Hodges caught up with Mike recently, and she began by asking him how much more lethal the COVID pandemic would have been if the viruses had been allowed to let rip rather than having public health experts step in to limit its impact.
Well, letting the virus rip in the early stages would have overwhelmed the NHS, which it nearly was. And of course, the only way the NHS coped really was to basically turn into COVID hospitals, unless you were dangerously ill. And so it almost did break the NHS, but luckily they reconfigured themselves, and we are going to be very grateful for that. But letting it rip wouldn't have been a good idea, because we'd have had loads of deaths. The NHS would have been more overwhelmed, and we may have ended up like other countries abroad where are we going to bury all these people?
Indeed. We were asked to wash our hands often during the COVID pandemic, and I know you're going to be delivering a talk shortly about the importance of this action and how it was first realised by a doctor in Victorian times, but how he was also ignored. Why was he ignored, and when did the penny drop that washing hands really was crucial in terms of preventing infections, or at least minimising them?
Yeah, well, this guy called Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, he wasn't the first person to talk about washing your hands and improving health, but I think he provided more evidence than most people. And I think the thing for him is, in those days, they didn't know about bacteria or viruses, and they believed germs were spread by breathing in foul-smelling air, so-called miasma. And, of course, he couldn't explain why washing the hands did anything, because how can that get rid of bad-smelling air? And so, as he couldn't explain why it worked, he got into a lot of arguments. And I think he was quite an argumentative guy. So I think he wasn't one person to win friends and influence people if he didn't believe his ideas. Then it came to be accepted when people realised there were bacteria, and that bacteria could cause diseases. And that really came in about the beginning of the 20th century with Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. And it was those two guys said, there are bacteria around and they can cause disease. And only when people tuned into that did they realise, washing your hands gets rid of bacteria and disease. So once the people saw the mechanism, people were more inclined to do it.
We talked about washing our hands, but of course it depends on how clean the water is. And I know that in other upcoming talks, you'll be focusing on, one is a doctor who hunted for the cause of cholera, and another who helped to bring about the development of a sewer system in London. And of course, what those two things have in common is the importance of clean water.
Yeah, and of course, one of the biggest improvements in public health has been clean water and proper sewage systems. And John Snow came around to London, and again, in the Victorian era, they still believed in miasma, that if you breathed in foul-smelling air, you get the disease. And cholera is a disease of the intestines, and he figured it can't be the air, you must be swallowing it by drinking bad water. And he did prove it, but no one believed him. He was ostracised. In his obituary, no one mentioned the contributions he played to public health. So again, a person who came up with the right idea, but at the wrong time in science, because the science says you can't possibly be right. Now, Joseph Bazalgette, of course, one way to improve disease is to stop people dumping things in the River Thames. Because in those days, everything went in the River Thames. Feces, urine from horses, humans, anything. And the only reason why London decided we've got to do something about this is when our glorious MPs couldn't get on with their work due to the smell coming from the River Thames. So Joseph Bazalgette then got this magnificent sewer system, a magnificent feat of Victorian engineering. And effectively what he did was took all the sewage away from populated areas of London and dumped it lower down the Thames where it was more tidal, so it would be washed out into the sea. There's no effort to treat it in those days, so that's all he did. So by doing that, once John Snow had come up with his idea, and Bazalgette showed that if you improve the Thames, there's less infectious diseases, people started to warm to the idea that clean water was important.
Looking ahead to another of your talks, you're going to be talking about antibiotics and how they work. Now, one concern I've often seen expressed is that the so-called superbugs are growing increasingly immune to antibiotics, and we urgently need the development of new antibiotics to counter this. How worrying is this trend?
Oh, there's several million people a year around the world die due to antibiotic resistance, and so people are taking it quite seriously. The issue about developing new antibiotics is you might not prescribe it straight away because you might want to see if the old ones work because they'd be cheaper before you prescribe these new antibiotic. And therefore that makes the manufacturing, the research and development very expensive because what we're going to do, spend billions on developing a new antibiotic for the NHS and all healthcare systems to put it on the shelf and only be used when conventional antibiotics don't work. So there's an issue there for policymakers about how they're going to make available new antibiotics.
Your final talk is on the subject of vaccination, the types there are and how they work. Given we have an anti-vax movement, and its influence has been largely spread, well, at least that's the view of many, by social media, how can both governments and individuals better counter their arguments and show that they're not based on science?
It's very hard because when vaccination first became vaguely aware in about the 17th century, people were against it then. And when Edward Jenner showed that cowpox could stop people getting smallpox, there was always adverts that, if you gave people cowpox, they would develop into a cow. So there's been this anti-vaccination thing since the year zero. It's hard to counteract because they have a belief system which isn't based on science. And all I would say recently, there's been a big measles outbreak in Birmingham. And for some children, measles is a killer. And that's simply because people think, measles doesn't occur anymore. I won't get vaccinated. And we can see what happens if you don't keep up the vaccination, the disease will spread.
Susie Hodges talking to Mike Trevethick. And a reminder that Mike will be giving a series of 5 talks starting on February the 28th. Details are on the u3a website, so do take a look. I mentioned earlier about the snowdrops and daffodils appearing, but we are still in February, and as we know with our British weather, February can often have a few nasty surprises up its sleeve. We still need those warm, comforting foods, the soups and stews. But what if you're a vegetarian or just want to change from meat-based food? Somebody who can answer that question is Alex Connell, the chef who has given many talks to u3a. When I met up with Alex recently, I asked him if he had any recipes to warm us up.
Certainly have. I've got a number of recipes, absolutely. First sort of set, if I like, are really, really easy ones, which are soup recipes. I'm just going to highlight 4 recipes. And unfortunately, I can't cook them on the radio. But anyway, so the first one I want to talk about very briefly is butternut squash. It really is one of the easiest things to do. Now, if you're not into peeling and chopping, then just put the whole thing into the oven and let it soften, and that'll make it so much easier to peel and chop. And then you just kind of roast it off and then mix it with some onions and some coconut milk and a few other things. Really, really delicious. The next one is peas and mint and a little bit of cream cheese in there, and some stock, some onions, a bit of garlic, a few herbs. Cook it away, and then with a stick blender, blend it away. It's delicious. And the last one is really simple. It's a sweet corn chowder. So it's slightly sweet because obviously it's got the sweet corn in, but essentially it's a tin of sweet corn. It's some onions, a bit of garlic, a little bit of lime and stock. Cook that away and then just give it a quick blend, and then you have a lovely, delicious soup. You can put some chilli in there if you fancy a bit of chilli too. So those are my recommended soups from the website. So do have a look at those.
I think it's great you mentioned about butternut squash, which I must confess I'm not a great fan of. The problem I've always had is peeling the thing and then cutting it up. It's like rock sometimes, isn't it?
It is. If you put it into the oven and if you've got the oven on, just pop it in and the whole thing, in the skin and everything, just put it on a tray and then leave it in there for about 15 minutes. It'll start to cook ever so slightly, and I'll make it so much softer for you then to slice it. But of course, you can't buy prepared butternut squash, all peeled and chopped fresh in most supermarkets, and of course you can also buy it frozen. There are ways around it, but yeah, I do admit that you need a sharp knife, that's for sure.
It can prove quite dangerous. What else have you got lined up?
Well, have a look on our website. We have got a great recipe for Lancashire hot pots. Now, all the recipes that we've got are vegetarian, or in fact, most of them are vegan. But please, if you're not vegetarian or vegan, please don't be put off by that. The dishes really are tried and tested, and they're absolutely delicious. But this one is particularly lovely, and it's one that I actually make at home. Part of my job is to do cookery demonstrations and talks and things. And this is one that I do when I'm out and about, but it is one that I also cook at home. Now, the base traditionally would have had lamb in there or beef in there, but with this one it uses corn pieces, which are really, really versatile things to use, and they really don't take that long to cook. So it's got corn pieces in there. It's also got some flageolet beans. I don't know why I put flageolet beans in. I really don't. I think this sound a bit posh, but anyway, they're just lovely. They've got a nice pale green colour, a nice texture and flavour, but of course any other beans would work well. Some peas, a few carrots and onions, and that's then you just cook that away with a little bit of stock, and then you just thicken it with a little bit of instant gravy powder, and you just sort of thicken it until you get a lovely bubbling base. And then for the topping, traditionally you'd put in raw potatoes on the top and then bake it in the oven or cook it in the oven for a couple of hours or so. But a really speedy way is to pre-cook your potatoes. So the day before, if you're having boiled potatoes or jack potatoes, just do a few extra ones, and then when you're making the hot pot, you've got the base all done, and just slice the potatoes and then gently fry them in a little bit of olive oil, and then just place them on the top, on either into the pan, or you can put it into a casserole dish, and then ta-da, it looks like it's been in the oven for hours, and it really is lovely and comforting, and it's perfect if it's a chilly day with a bit of pickled beetroot or pickled cabbage as well. Either of those work well, so I really thoroughly go for that one. Alternatively, and it's kind of similar ingredients, I guess, is to go for some cottage pie. Now, I've actually got a couple of recipes on there. I can't split them; they're both tasty. But essentially, we're all familiar with these things. You can buy them as ready meals, of course, and pop them in the microwave or in the oven, and it's done in what they call a plop. And it's handy, and that's the way many of us live. But to make your own from scratch, it really is. I think it's a real pleasure. If you've got a few friends around or a few family members around, it's really lovely to make it a large one. And if there's just two or just one, still go for a larger one. And then when it's baked, you can split it in half and put half of it, cool it, put half of it in the freezer for another day.
Yeah, there was some great recipes there. As you say, they're on your website. Can you just remind us?
Of course, yeah. So if you simply type in Vegetarian for Life, so information on nutrition, loads and loads of recipes on there, and information to support older people that are vegan and vegetarian. But even if you're not vegetarian or vegan, do have a look.
Now, I know you have done quite a lot of cookery demonstrations for U3A, which have always been very, very popular. Have we got any more lined up?
We haven't at the moment. Have a look on the main your main site, and you'll see some listed there.
Some good advice there from Alex Connell. And if you would like to find more recipes, then as Alex suggested, go to the website vegetarianforlife.org.uk. Or, of course, you can tune into one of Alex's U3A cookery demonstrations. Just check on the U3A website for details. Music is a key ingredient in the lives of many of our members. Perhaps only a handful have the lute as their main focus. David Prothero of Farnham U3A is one such, and his passion extends to being a member of a European Lute Orchestra. He's been explaining to Joe Watson how his interest in the instrument began.
Well, like many people of my generation, I grew up listening to Julian Bream. My brother and I both play the guitar. But Julian Bream not only played the guitar, he also played the lute, and he was one of the first people really to popularise it. And I never thought that I would get a chance to play the lute. It seemed very obscure. I wouldn't know how to get hold of one, for example.
Now, you don't go into a normal music shop and say, I'll have a 17th century lute. So where do you get them from?
We're very fortunate. I think part of the lute revival in the 50s and 60s was led by craftsmen coming from the arts and crafts movement who wanted to see what the original lutes were like. So they travelled around the museums of Europe, measuring up the original instruments and trying to recreate them. There's a lot of trial and error. And we now have probably a couple of dozen luthiers in this country, and more in France, Germany, Spain, Italy, who are making lutes full-time. So if you want a lute, you have to commission one from a luthier.
I always think of the sound of a lute as being quite ethereal. It doesn't sound like a guitar. How would you best describe the sound of it?
It's softer. I find it fuller than the guitar because the lute has this rounded body. It's very resonant. The strings are less taut than the guitar. So if I play a guitar now, I find it very hard to play because the strings need a lot of pressure to play them. Whereas on the lute, the French word is toucher. You just touch the strings and the resonance produces a sound. So it's a much lighter action compared to the guitar.
A couple of months ago, you went into Europe as part of a lute festival. Explain a bit about that.
I went to Italy, a place called Prato, outside Florence, courtesy of the Italian Lute Society. The English Lute Society is very active, and our secretary, Chris Goodwin, fosters relations with lute societies in other countries. He went over to Italy, he met lutenists there, and he encouraged them to form their own society. That was probably about 10 years ago, I think. And at the same time, they decided, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a European Lute Orchestra? So the first performance of that was in Vicenza in Italy, with members of lute societies in Italy, Spain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and of course England. And it's been playing every year since then. It's a very special sound. The first time I played with it was about 5 years ago. We were playing in Florence, and we were rehearsing in a church in the district where Galileo lived. Galileo the astronomer came from a lute-playing family, and he himself played the lute. So we were actually playing 40 lutes in an orchestra in the church that would have been frequented by Galileo, reproducing a sound that hadn't been heard for 400 years.
I don't know which of your instruments you took with you, because some of them are not small, and there's always that thing about what you do with putting it on a plane. So did you give them their own seat?
Well, yes, this time I had to buy a seat, even though I took the biwela, which is my smallest instrument. In the past, I've gone by train, which is quite a nice way to go. It takes, 24 hours. Then I could take a bigger lute. That's part of the problem, because half the people in the orchestra are from outside Italy, and a lot of them end up travelling by car long distances from Germany or from the Netherlands. Very few actually take the plane because of the hassle of actually having to buy a seat.
So does anybody actually write music today for the lute?
Yes, on the Lute website we have a space for modern compositions. I myself have written some music. I wrote some quartets, because actually the repertoire for lute quartet is very restricted. There's only about 3 collections of quartets that have survived today from Elizabethan times. So I wanted to write a piece that if people had got together for a quartet, if they'd run out of repertoire, they could at least play my quartets. And I was very lucky to have them performed about 3 or 4 years ago with some very eminent lutenists.
The beautiful sound of the lute, being played there by David Prothero. And if you want to find out more, the Lute Society has a very comprehensive website. Continuing with the arts, poetry is very popular in u3a, both reading and writing it, mainly for fun, but Christopher Reid is both a former publisher and also a professional poet. Maggie D met up with Christopher recently and asked him when he first became interested in poetry.
Well, very early on, because my parents had a few books around the house, and 2 of them were important to me. One of them was Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, which of course combines narrative prose with poetry, and actually also importantly it combines pictures. And I was totally entranced by that. And the other book they had was a selection from Punch magazine, and Punch magazine used to occasionally print frivolous poems. I didn't know they were frivolous. I just thought they were fascinating. And so Lewis Carroll and Punch combined made me very, very interested in this thing called verse, and I started trying to write it myself.
And at which point did you think, I could perhaps make a living at this?
I think most children don't think about making a living. They think they know what they like. They have no practical sense of where their likings are going to take them. But I think it was at Oxford, really. I wasn't a good student at Oxford. I studied English, but I didn't really care for the way that English literature was taught and discussed. And I was alienated from it, really. But then when I graduated, at the same time I received a bequest from my godfather, £500, which in 1971 took you a very long way indeed. It kept me going for a year and a bit. And during that time, I practiced writing.
And you've written actually many editions of poetry, your collections. But there was one in particular that got you an award. Can you tell us about that? I mean, you've had several awards, but I mean the Costa Award.
Yes. Well, in 2005, my wife died, and I had to write about her. She was a very extraordinary woman and very talented. She was an actor, and she was very, very lively, a vigorous and unforgettable personality. And I just simply wanted to get her, all that I thought about her And all about all of that I was thinking too about the condition of bereavement and grief down into words. And so it took me about 3 years to fulfill that project. And the book was called A Scattering. And to my astonishment, first of all, it was put on the shortlist for the Costa Poetry Prize. And then it was on the shortlist for the Costa Book of the Year award, and then it won.
Were you shocked?
I was bowled over.
Did these awards actually bring any financial remuneration with them?
Oh yes. So a lot of money came with that. Mm.
Now, you've written loads of books, haven't you?
I have.
Have they all been poetry?
Yes, the ones that I've written, I've also edited. But one of the things I was most pleased to be asked to do was to edit the letters of Ted Hughes. That came out in 2007. And right now I'm finishing off an edition of the letters of Seamus Heaney. They're both poets that I worked with when I was in publishing. I was their editors at Faber and Faber.
How long were you there?
All in all, about 13 years.
A fair amount of time then. And still producing poetry yourself as well.
I rather put it aside during that period. I won't blame my poets, but because I was concentrating on their work, and a publisher's life is a busy one, I didn't do a great deal of my own writing. And one of the things that persuaded me to leave publishing was when shortly before his death, Ted Hughes was on the phone to me, and he asked me, if I'd been writing anything lately, and I had to confess that I hadn't. And he said, "Well, that's not good." And I remembered his dismay at hearing that news. And then, of course, he died, and I was dismayed at that news. But I also recalled that he'd admonished me. Very shortly after that, I decided, well, I'll see if I can make a go of freelance writing life.
Wasn't that what you were doing before you became an editor?
Yes, but one of the reasons I took a salaried job was that it was getting very difficult to sustain a freelance life at that moment. Nonetheless, when the chance came to pick it up again, I didn't hesitate. I knew it was what I ought to be doing. And you trust on luck in those cases.
You've recently been on a brief tour in California. Can you tell us a bit about that? Well,
I was invited to talk to students at various universities. Now, I can do that. Creative writing students, yes, I can engage in conversation with them. But somehow teaching for the purposes of exams, no, I couldn't do that. It's possible too that I simply don't believe in exams. I don't know that they're the best way of training a mind at all.
No, but there has to be some sort of yardstick, doesn't there?
I don't know even if there does. I'm a bit of an anarchist where that's concerned.
But your latest edition that has been published, Toys, Tricks and Traps, that was what you were on tour promoting, I believe.
Well, yes, and the book's only just come out. I wasn't really promoting the book. I just happened to have it with me, and that was what I wanted to read from.
Christopher Reid talking with Maggie D. At the beginning of the podcast, I spoke about a new book coming out this month. Well, we didn't have to travel very far to find the author, who is none other than our very own Jo Watson. Charles Runcie caught up with Jo and began by asking her why did she decide to write the book.
I've always been fascinated with the Olympics ever since the first games that I have any memory of, which was 1968, really because of the multiplicity of games. So you might have an interest in athletics or you might have an interest in swimming, but suddenly you're seeing sports you've never seen before. And I remember in Tokyo, for example, being addicted to wall climbing. Now, I'd never seen competitive wall climbing. And suddenly a lot of people who are quite casual fans suddenly become armchair experts on something. But it's as much about the people as it is about the records from my perspective. And that's really how I've written the book.
What is the continuing appeal of the Olympic Games to everyone after so long and so many games?
I think, A, the personalities, which are important because they attract people. Secondly, the fact that you see so many different sports. And I always remember somebody saying that after Olga Korbut and Nadia Comaneci, you couldn't get a place in a gym club in Britain because all the little girls turned up to go and do gymnastics where they'd had no real thought about it before. And I think when we see breakdancing in Paris, that's going to elevate the sort of demand there. So I think it attracts people who are not necessarily main sports fans but have an interest in sport. It is, in effect, the Luke Littler sort of appeal that we had in the darts at the World Championships recently.
And there are so many sports, of course, that we never see from one Olympics to the other unless you're very, very much an addict for, say, dressage or wall climbing.
Absolutely. I'm sure you'll be watching wall climbing with interest.
Reading the book, there are so many stories that make you go, oh, my goodness me. Have you got any favourites in particular?
A couple there I'll mention. One was the chap Norris Williams, who was on the Titanic when it sank. He managed to escape, swim to a life raft. His legs were really badly frostbitten, and the doctor said, look, we're going to have to amputate. And he said, no, I'll need those legs. And he went on to become a tennis champion. He served with distinction in the First World War, and he won the mixed doubles in Paris in 1924, which is quite extraordinary that a Titanic survivor would do that. There was the Lithuanian basketball team in 92. Now, 92 was the Dream Team Americans. It was also after the Soviets had broken up. And the Lithuanians were fantastic basketball players, originally for the Soviet Union. But they had no money come to Barcelona. And this story circulated, and it was picked up in San Francisco by some members of the Grateful Dead rock group who decided to put some money into the kitty for them. And then an artist said, well, I'll design you a new T-shirt, which is in the new Lithuanian colours. It's a very sort of quite garish tie-dye sort of shirt. And the Lithuanians wore this. They were allowed to sell Grateful Dead merchandise. The Grateful Dead fans then thought, well, we better have one of these T-shirts. Shall we go to our concert? And when it came to the games, the Lithuanians beat what was the unified ex-Soviet team to win a bronze medal.
Some listeners might remember London 1948, which came 3 years after the end of a world war, a remarkable achievement to put it on. Did you think that was the greatest of all games in terms of organisational, personal achievement that you researched?
It's difficult to assess because there were so many, but I think that the Olympic movement needed a games after the war. And they must have been incredibly grateful that Great Britain, despite the adversities that they'd gone through, were able to do it.
In London, of all places, which had been, bombed to bits.
Yeah, it was known as the Austerity Olympics. I remember doing some research into that, and the rowing was at Henley, but they didn't close the river before the event. So there were, someone's national boat was colliding with someone's pleasure boat going down the river. The rationing was really in place. And the one story of talking to some people who lived in Wembley, they'd been watching the opening ceremony procession build up. And the US, who were right back at the end of the procession, had brought these fantastic picnics with them. All the food was flown in. And when they moved off, the locals just descended on the leftovers because there was food there they hadn't seen for a decade. It was like heaven for them. So it was a very, very, very strange Olympics. The lighting was poor. The running track had been laid on top of the Greyhound track. It rained on and off, but it was very hot on the opening day, so the pigeons got roasted in their baskets before they could be opened. There were a lot of idiosyncrasies about it, but the fact that they actually got a games on, I think, actually was momentous in the future going forward for the Olympic movement.
It occurs to me during this interview that this is the kind of book for people to buy who aren't actually that interested in sport. It's more about the people than the actual sport.
I hope I've got a mixture that will attract people who have if you like the armchair sports people. As I say, it's not a stats book. There are a few mentioned, but it's really to do with the people and some of their backstories, and to hopefully give a feeling of why people are so attracted to an Olympic Games.
And if you could get in a time machine with Doctor Who and go back in time to games that you haven't been at, which one would it be?
That's really tricky. 24, the Chariots of Fire Games, which is Little Abrahams. That was obviously a phenomenal game, also in Paris, and of course it's the centenary of that. Paavo Nurmi, Johnny Weissmuller, the first Tarzan, he was in those Olympics. 76 actually appeals. That was Nadia Comaneci.
Mm-hmm.
It was also the great modern pentathlon, Boris Onyshchenko with his rigged épée. And the British team, they won the gold, but they only got one medal between the three of them. And this was an IOC ruling. If it was a team event, you only got one gold medal. So when they came home, a London jeweller cast them 3 medals. And then a double glazing firm came along and they cast them alternate medals. But very sadly, the one gold medal they did get, which was normally held at the Modern Pentathlon HQ and taken out for shows and whatever, went out one day and never came back, and they don't know where it is.
Somewhere out there is an Olympic gold medal. More fascinating facts are in Joe's book, In the Footsteps of Olympia, A Concise History of the Summer Games, which will be on sale from the 28th of February at $12.99 and is published by Grosvenor House Publishing. Well, sadly, we've run out of time, but thank you for listening. And if you have an interesting story to tell or would like to contact the U3a podcast team, don't hesitate to get in touch. And you can do that by emailing communications@u3a.org.uk. All that remains for me to do is to thank all our guests and our presenters, Maggie D, Charles Runcie, Susie Hodges and Joe Watson. Studio production was by Lee Wellbrook. But on behalf of all of us, this is me, Peter Cliff, saying thank you for listening and looking forward to meeting you again next month.